for me, the goal has never been surviving. The goal has been figuring out how to live.
Didn't want that stigma, oh, that's the guy with the testicle problem.
Being comfortable with a certain type of fear and being comfortable with a certain type of uncertainty is something you kind of have to develop.
And to then have to be put in a position of, I'm going to fight to be heard.
I feel compelled to snap, to clap, to give you a standing ovation.
Welcome to the latest episode of The Future You, our show about the next frontiers in health, longevity, and building stronger, longer lives. Today, we're going to be talking about a disease that will impact pretty much every human being at some point in their lives, either directly or indirectly. We're talking about cancer, of course. We're going to be joined by Colin Egglesfield, who you will recognize from TV and films, and who will talk to us about his experience. Suleika Jaouad, the best-selling author of The Book of Alchemy, and my favorite, Between Two Kingdoms, along with Dr. Elizabeth Comen, medical oncologist and co-director of the Mignone Women's Health Collaborative at NYU Langone, who will help us unpack the latest on prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. Welcome, both of you. And Suleika, we're going to start with you. You've told your story with such generosity and grace. Your stunning 2021 memoir about sickness, survival, and transformation. For those of you who haven't read Between Two Kingdoms, I'm hoping you'll do it one more time and tell us a little bit about the early days of your experience with cancer. And if you can, really like the day that you received your diagnosis.
So in 2010, almost exactly a year after I graduated from college, I was diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia. And I think like anyone who's been on the receiving end of a diagnosis like that, it really felt like this cleaving moment in my life. There was my life before. And there was everything that came after. But strangely, and maybe even perversely, with that diagnosis, I felt immense relief. I had been sick for almost a year leading up to that. I had gone to see many different doctors, each of whom had treated the specific ailment or symptom that I was coming to them with, but nobody really seemed to be taking a look at the big picture. And worse than that, perhaps because of my age or maybe because of some subconscious bias, I felt like nobody was taking me seriously. Prior to my actual diagnosis, I had been in the hospital for nearly a week where the doctors ran every test they could think of except for a bone marrow biopsy, which they ultimately felt wasn't necessary for someone of my age. And I was released from the hospital and told that I needed to go home, get some rest, maybe see a therapist, and start taking better care of myself.
Were these male physicians, just out of curiosity?
They were all male
physicians.
It's
funny how that happens.
Yeah. It is funny how that happens. And so I really started to feel like whatever it was that I was feeling was in my head, that I was the problem. The problem was one that was self-fabricated. And so, as terrifying as it was to get that diagnosis, it was also a relief to be believed and to hopefully be able to do something about it. But I think that experience of getting sick when you're young, it really does feel like a breach of contract with the natural order of things. And nothing prepares you for a diagnosis like that at any age. But at 22, I was, a year too old for pediatrics, but decades younger than a lot of the patients around me. And I think, cancer and really any experience that brings you face to face with your mortality has a way of forcing you to look at the big questions and to figure out what's important to you and what you want your days to contain.
Right. So the diagnosis was preceded by what sounds like pretty intense illness and mysterious illness, which caused you to be more proactive when it comes to your health. Dr. Comen, a lot of people, women in particular, sometimes will not perceive or will not be proactive when it comes to getting treatment, to seeing a physician. And when you talk to patients, what are some of the concerns you hear about when it comes to testing diagnosis? Like if they're, procrastinating about a mammogram, or they're shrugging off symptoms, or they're putting themselves second. Like what are some of the conversations you're having?
Well, I think I would flip the script a little bit on that.
Oh, good.
I'm not so sure that they're not proactive about going to the doctor. I think what Suleika spoke to was, I titled my book All in Her Head. And I don't like the fact that it resonates with so many women. The idea that you go to the doctor and not only are there immense gaps in our understanding of women's health or the different disorders that can affect women, but so many women of all ages will leave with some sort of feeling that they were told they need to see a therapist. It's all in their head. They need to focus on self-care, take a bubble bath, go to the gym, eat better, when in fact something in your case was far more insidious. And I think it also speaks to the fragmented nature of care that we provide just not only women, but also men, that you can see so many different subspecialties end in an ist, like oncologist, cardiologist, gastroenterologist, but who is really looking at the whole picture? And we don't really have a system in our healthcare landscape that really, yes, we have primary care, but if you look at who goes into that, it's increasingly dropping because we're not supporting primary care and care that allows for the whole person to be valued, both by the doctor treating the patient, but also the patient themselves. And to your question about advocacy, I think it's really, really hard when you're in pain, when you're sick, when you're suffering.
When you're young,
to then have to be put in a position of, I'm going to fight to be heard. I think it's a double whammy. And I think it's incredibly more so for women as well, in which we have a long legacy of not believing women in their illness. And, fortunately with advocates such as yourself, I think we're beginning to change that narrative.
In addition to going to see a physician and undergoing things like CBCs and more sort of traditional diagnostic tools, there are a lot of things that people are doing sort of on their own or through different types of specialists, whether that's genetic testing, whether it's things like the Gale model, whether it's the quiz that's going around now about that Olivia Munn has talked about as far as breast cancer. Yes. So what are some of the different tools and different tests that women should be thinking about? Maybe that you don't even need a physician to do, but that they should be thinking about when it comes to early diagnosis.
Well, I want to say first and foremost, there was no early diagnostic tool that would have picked up what you had, Suleika. But perhaps if we had had a system that addressed your concerns sooner, not that your outcome would necessarily be different because you're doing well, but that you would have been heard sooner. And I wish that for you. But in terms of general cancer screening, there are basic guidelines that you can talk to your doctor about. And it's important, if you can know your family history, to know your family history on your mother's side and your father's side, and talk to whether it's your gynecologist, your primary care doctor, about what are your individual risk factors for lots of different types of cancers, so that we can then personalize the type of genetic testing that we can do to understand what you may be at risk for, and look at some of the standard screening modalities that we can use, like mammograms. So the average age that we recommend women get mammograms is age 40. But if you have a higher than average risk for breast cancer, you may be looking to screen earlier than that. And that's what Olivia Munn was talking about. So something called the Breast Cancer Risk Assessment Tool is what you can literally Google. It's the one time I say you can Google it. It's okay. Bring that information to your doctor, and it will allow you to plug in just some simple facts about your own health and determine whether you may be eligible to screen earlier for breast cancer, and with different modalities other than mammogram.
There are things you can determine whether or not you can be a little bit more proactive with your physicians.
Exactly.
So, Suleika, going back to you received this diagnosis. Who is the first person you share the news with, and how long after that diagnosis?
The very first person I shared that news with were my parents. I think, it doesn't matter how educated you are, when you're given a life-threatening diagnosis, having a caregiver who can be your advocate is both the greatest privilege, and for me has proven to be, the most important aspect of finding my way through this. And so I was fortunate to have both my parents who were there and who needed to be there, because I wasn't able to get care locally. It meant not just relocating myself to a big city where I could have access to the treatment that I needed, but inevitably it meant my family having to relocate as well. And so, that relationship to the caregiver is such a complex one. At 22, all I wanted was to be independent. I did not want to regress to a level of care I hadn't needed from the time that I was a toddler. But I think, the social aspect,
the support system you have to build, right?
Finding that support system is incredibly challenging. When people don't know what to say, often they don't say anything at all.
Or they'll say something, and then what? right? Like it's not going away, and it's not something that asking a million times is going to change necessarily the answer.
What surprised me was far more challenging than the toxicity of the treatments I was doing was the sense of isolation that came with it. People, meanwhile, they want to fix things. And so what often ends up happening is we reach for platitudes. We say, keep searching for the silver lining. We say things like, God doesn't give you more than you can handle, which when you're 22, that can be particularly enraging.
Right.
And what happens, I think, in an attempt to put on a brave, stoic, positive face, whether you're the person in the hospital that are sitting in the caregiver's chair, is that people stay in their silos. Yeah. They don't say the thing that is on everyone's mind. They don't name the fears. They don't talk about the challenging aspects of not just enduring this experience, but living through it together, because it really does affect not just the patient, but everyone who's in the radius of the patient.
Yeah.
I see this all the time, and it's like I want to erect this force field around my patients. One thing that really I'm on a mission to fix, if possible, is the battle analogies and metaphors we use for cancer patients. There's nobody that wants to lose their battle, right? And they wouldn't fight courageously. I mean, it is a horrible way to think about, I think, how patients are struggling and living with their cancer. There's no patient that I've ever had that died of their cancer that didn't have a will to live.
Right. I didn't fight for it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it really puts the blame, like they just didn't will it enough. They didn't visualize it. They didn't work hard enough. Or those patients that choose to die with a type of dignity that is their choice. And that is not a battle. That is their own existential path.
Yeah.
And I would hope that we can evolve towards better, more compassionate, thoughtful language when we talk to patients. The other thing, it's like you find people grasping for these different words, like, well, what stage is your cancer?
Right.
As if you know.
Right.
As if the patient knows, and then in turn, is the layperson then going to weigh in on their advice? Oh, my neighbor had this too, and therefore you should have this green juice. And I think there's this tsunami of input that can really be overwhelming and not hold space for the types of conversations that patients really want to be having.
And to that point, I think it can leave a patient feeling like there is a right and a wrong way to suffer, and a tremendous amount of self-imposed pressure to be someone who suffers well, whatever that means.
Right. In a way, I think there's this seductive appeal of certainty with all of life, but with something like cancer, where fear and uncertainty really become like your constant companions, right? How has your relationship with certainty changed over time? I mean, I love the idea of at 22, like this was not what we talked about. Like this is
totally,
it's not on the vision board.
Not in my 5-year plan.
Yes, not in your 5-year plan. So I would imagine that type of relationship, being comfortable with a certain type of fear and being comfortable with a certain type of uncertainty is something you kind of have to develop.
Yeah, I think, to learn to swim in that ocean of uncertainty has been my constant work. It's our constant work. And what was so humbling about getting that diagnosis at such a young age, and more than that, having a prognosis that wasn't particularly favorable, was that it removed the illusion of certainty,
control
that I never had, that none of us have. I've was re-diagnosed a decade later, and again a year ago. I'll be going straight to chemo from this conversation, and so my relationship to uncertainty in some ways is more fraught than ever when you've been diagnosed with leukemia for the 3rd time. And, that's the kind of thing that can make the future feel like a really scary place, because you don't know if you're going to exist in that future. It can be hard to make a plan 6 months down the road because you're worried that if the plan won't come to pass, it'll break your heart. And so better to not make the plan. And so I've had to actively try to shift out of my fear of uncertainty into a kind of respect for the mystery of how things unfold, and the knowledge that, well, sometimes that can bring about a plot twist in your life that maybe isn't desired, it also means that there's the possibility for something interesting and surprising and even welcome to unfold alongside of it. So, a year ago when I got this news, I kept saying to my oncologist, I don't know how to live with this degree of uncertainty. I want to know what's going to happen to me so that I can make the right choices. I want a crystal ball. Of course, that's not possible. And he kept saying to me, you have to live every day as if it's your last. That's how you deal with the uncertainty. And that was well-intentioned advice. And every time he told me, to live every day as if it were my last, I felt intense panic and I felt really stressed out. Like every family dinner has to be as meaningful as humanly possible. And every moment needs to be cherished. And that is a spiritually exhausting way to live. And at some point I decided I don't want to do that anymore. And I don't even know that that is a good strategy, because when you're living every day as if it's your last, you're living it from that place of scarcity. So I've had to shift to a gentler mindset of trying to live every day as if it's my first. Waking up with a sense of curiosity and wonder that a little kid might. And when I do that, I'm not afraid of the uncertainty. I'm not racing to cross off big bucket list items. I'm able to have what might be a perfectly mundane moment, like hanging out on the couch with my husband and dogs, and to be present with that. And so that's been my antidote to the fear of the uncertainty, to focus on cultivating that simpler, maybe smaller sense of daily wonder.
Can I just say that, I'm sitting here fighting back tears because I'm a crier, but you are exactly why I became an oncologist. Even though I treat breast cancer patients, a lot of people say, well, why? And yes, the biology is fascinating. And, I like to be a diva sometimes. People are like, why aren't you a dermatologist? And we'd be like, better fit the personality. The reality is this incredible connection to these bigger existential questions of why and how we live really is such a sacred gift to have from my patients. And you articulate it so beautifully, because if all we're thinking about is, oh my God, I have to live my life to the fullest, there's pressure in that. And yet we want to be pulled from the mundane of, oh my God, like I'm worried about how my hair looks today, or like, did I gain an extra pound, or whatever it may be. And it's such a gift to hear you speak about it from your perspective, and the way that you say, every day is the first day of the rest of your life. And none of us have this certainty about what tomorrow brings, but what if we can bring that wonder to our own lives? And I'm so grateful that you have this voice to share that with so many people. And I hope you have the biggest platform ever for it.
I mean, you're in many ways the business of difficult conversations. I'm sure people have asked you for a crystal ball many times.
Yeah.
In your time as a physician, as an oncologist, have you noticed a shift in how you or your colleagues have talked about cancer with your patients, had those sort of conversations that Suleika had with her physician? Has the attitude changed? Has the approach changed?
I think it's definitely changed for me as I've gotten older. And, I'm both a mother and a daughter, and I've had loved ones die in my family. I've had young mothers pass away. I've had young women pass away. And as I get older than the age of my patients, that has really affected me. But I think the other really big thing that's improved about the landscape, about how we talk about treating breast cancer in particular, is a bigger assessment of the quality of life. I mean, for so long, we effectively have been castrating women with breast cancer, 2/3 of them, right? We go through this immense estrogen deprivation, and then we're like, oh my gosh, but you're alive. Like, you must feel great because you're alive. Live every day to your fullest. We've saved your life. But, sex feels awful. Your joints feel like crap. You can't wake up every day and live that day as it's the first day of the rest of your life because you're miserable. I think that we are doing a much better job of asking patients, how are you feeling, literally feeling in terms of your quality of life? What are you not able to do in your days that we could help you address better? And I think that's one thing that I'm proud to say we've evolved as a community of oncologists, but I really enjoy those conversations with my patients. How do you find joy, right? Not just what's your next prescription that I'm going to give you, but how do you find joy and how do we weave that in a personal manner to how we treat you so that we're not just treating the disease, we're treating the person.
There's such an emphasis on curing cancer. And of course, that's what we all want. I want that more than anybody. But I think, there's not much thought, to your point, about what happens if and when the cancer is cured, and what it means to carry the long-term imprints of an illness, whether those imprints are the imprints on your body or on your quality of life. And ultimately, for me, the goal has never been surviving. The goal has been figuring out how to live. And there's an important distinction there. And just in, the last decade, and I've had the misfortune and perhaps the privilege of getting to witness that progress being made in real time. At 22, nobody was asking me about my mental health when I was sick. There was no survivorship clinic. That became my work. That's the reason I wrote Between Two Kingdoms, is because it was that feeling of not being sick perhaps anymore in a clinical sense, but feeling far from unwell, and knowing that, when you've put yourself through something like chemotherapy or radiation or surgery, you want it to be for something. Being alive, being cured, surviving to the next day is not enough and should not be enough. Our standards of care and what it means to be well need to expand to encompass not just what's happening in your bone marrow, but what your days look like, what they contain.
Right. And I think, Between Two Kingdoms is an allusion to Susan Sontag, who wrote many things, but including illness as metaphor. And there's been this stigma attached particularly to cancer, but to a lot of conditions, where it's like somehow someone's fault or they did something wrong. And I think for a long time, there was a sense of shame around it, or certainly weirdness. And to Dr. Comen's point, I think you used your platform through that book and through many others to sort of rip away and to sort of grind down those stigmas, because it's a human body, right? And it does weird things and it's things we can't control. And I think you write with great grace and honesty about that journey. Do you sense a change in how cancer is perceived in the larger culture?
I think as our life expectancy increases, as we survive illnesses that would have killed our great-grandparents or maybe even our parents, that sense of binary that we are either sick or healthy, I think has become far more nuanced. The border between the two kingdoms is porous, and we exist on a spectrum of wellness depending on the day or the month or the season. And so I think that understanding has changed. I think, the challenge, the challenge that you spoke to, that your book title speaks to, is ongoing. So a decade after my first diagnosis, I knew I wasn't well. I could see it in my patient portal that my red blood cell count was trending downward. And I kept asking for a bone marrow biopsy. And I kept being told, you're a decade out, you recently had Lyme disease, or, perhaps COVID contributed, having COVID contributed to these fluctuations in your red blood cell count, you're okay. And I am not actually someone who feels particularly empowered when I'm sitting on an exam table. I don't have a medical degree. And I think, like a lot of patients, that feeling of intimidation or overwhelm, especially when you're in a position where you're being told one thing and you're having to either push back or say nothing at all, is incredibly difficult to do. But I've learned the hard way that you have to advocate for yourself, no matter how wonderful your medical team might be. And so I demanded a bone marrow biopsy. And the day of my biopsy, the same nurse who cared for me at 22, who still cares for me now, who is someone I adore and love deeply, and I know she adores and loves me deeply, said to me, "We can still cancel this biopsy. We're just doing it because of your anxiety." And I felt so embarrassed in that moment, like I was being hysterical, like I was being dramatic. And the only reason I went through it is because I had asked a friend to accompany me, and she had taken the day off of work, and I wanted it to feel worth her while,
Right.
which is embarrassing. I wish it wasn't the case that the leukemia was back. But what I will say, my nurse said to me, that moment has forever changed the way that I talk to my patients. I didn't want it to be true, and I wasn't listening to you, and I knew better. And I really appreciate the openness of that kind of dialogue that's happening, not just in the privacy of an exam room, but that's happening across the internet and in spaces like this.
I would love to bring in a different voice, a different experience. We're going to be joined by Colin Egglesfield, who you will recognize from TV and films, and who will talk to us about his experience. Colin Egglesfield is joining us remote from Scottsdale, Arizona. Colin, welcome. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Rich. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being here. So we've been talking a lot about all the complex dynamics around cancer diagnosis and treatment. To hear some version of the phrase, "you've got cancer," is enough for most people for a whole lifetime. You have heard it 3 times. I'm hoping you'll take me back to the first time that you remember having that conversation with your physician and just what was going through your mind.
Yeah, well, it's like when you're younger, you just feel invincible. And I was 32 years old when I first got diagnosed with testicular cancer, and I had just been hired on All My Children, the soap opera, was living the dream. And 6 months into my 3-year contract, I noticed my, for lack of a better description, and I hate this word, testicle, because it's just the weirdest.
We're all adults here. It's testicle.
And so I noticed that my left testicle had swollen, and I was in this place of feeling like, well, it'll just go away. It'll take care of itself.
Body's weird. Lots of things going on.
It's weird. I mean, I'm a guy, like whatever. So I went to the urologist. They ordered a ultrasound and a blood test. So I went down there into his office, and just sitting across from him and this was on a Friday, he said, "You have advanced stage testicular cancer. I'm scheduling you for surgery on Monday."
It's a hell of a bombshell to drop on someone on a Friday afternoon.
To hear those words, it's like, cancer happens to other people.
Right.
I'm healthy. I'm young. This is a mistake. And so I just was kind of in that denial phase. And I said, "Well, could we do it on Tuesday?" And the look on his face was, "Okay, did you hear what I just told you?
Right.
You have cancer."
Who did you tell, if anyone?
Told my parents, I told my brother, my sister, and my mom came out she flew out to be with me during the surgery. I told a couple of my good friends, but I didn't tell anyone at work. I just didn't want that stigma. I was afraid of what people would say, or, "Oh, that's the guy with the testicle problems." And I just didn't want to have that to be a distraction. And I was new to the show, and the last thing I wanted to do was have this stop me from doing what I, had been working so hard towards. And every 3 months I was going for my checkups, chest x-ray, CAT scan, blood test. At the year mark of having had the first surgery, they discovered that I had a tumor on the second.
So at this point, did you feel like you'd beaten it? Had that been the sort of conversation?
Yeah.
You were feeling pretty good. Like you were like, cancer, I did it. Like, and then surprise.
And then surprise. And I was like, what are you talking about?
We just did this.
I just did this. And it was only a year after. And that's when I was just like, what's going on here? They said, "Yep, you've got testicular cancer on this other side." And so at that point, now, the thought was, well, can they just maybe cut out part of the tumor and save part of my testicles so that I can still produce sperm to have children down the line? And they said, that's just a risky
Right.
way to do this. So I ended up banking some sperm.
Uh-huh.
So my dudes are on ice
Uh-huh.
on a sperm bank somewhere on the
Ready to be deployed.
Upper East Side of New York City.
Was it different the second time around, having that sort of cancer experience, having been through it already, learning what you learned, experiencing what you experienced? Was it easier? Was it more difficult? Was it more annoying?
Good question. It was scarier. At this point, I felt like, okay, I beat it that first time that, cancer happens to people, but now this second time and just 1 year later, that's when it was like, okay, what is going on? And what was scary about that second surgery was that I was worried about, am I ever going to get an erection again? Am I going to be able to have sex ever again? But I started on hormone replacement therapy, and essentially it's androgel, and you can get testosterone injections, but now they've got this gel that you basically just rub on your shoulders every day. And a few days after the surgery, that second one, and I took that androgel, that first time I got my first erection.
Oh my gosh.
Thank God.
Congratulations. It's gonna be okay. It might be okay. So that was your second experience, and a long time goes by, almost like a whole lifetime, decades almost.
Fast forward to a year and a half ago. Here we go again. So went for the biopsy, and on one side of my prostate, they detected these cancerous cells. Most men end up being diagnosed with prostate cancer at some point in their life if you live long enough.
It's something you die with as opposed to die from.
Correct. They say most people die with it rather than from it. But they said, Colin, because you're 50 years old, you've got about a 5-year window before this will turn into most likely some sort of metastasized cancer that can spread to other parts of your body.
How are you doing today? How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great. The incontinence isn't an issue. I would say when I'm in the gym sometimes and I'm like lifting really heavy weights, maybe a little
tinkle?
occasional once, like if my bladder is full, but I would say
I mean, maybe me too. I mean, I think it happens to everybody, whether you've had a prostatectomy or not.
So I would say any guy out there who's worried about having this surgery, I would say now being on the other side of it, I'm glad I had it. I feel relieved. I feel like I don't have to worry about this. The incontinence thing is not an issue. My doctor, the way he described it was when you have the surgery, the nerves that control erectile function, they essentially get shocked and they go to sleep, for lack of a better description. And he said it usually takes about 6 months for those nerves to start waking up again, to have any sort of like, I'm now 6 months later, and I would say I'm probably around, and this is just full disclosure, I'm around like 60% where there's activity down there, but there's still some.
You're also 50, 3 years old? 50? I mean, again,
You
older guys out there know what I'm saying.
I think the most important thing is everything is now positive and moving forward in a really positive direction. And I know that I'm going to be around long enough now to be able to do more movies and do more of the things that I really want to be doing, and hopefully be an advocate, share my platform to be able to tell other guys that, yeah, this is scary and it's not ideal, but the manly thing to do, especially if you have people that depend on you and care about you, it's not just about you. It's if you care about the people in your life, you will do this for them.
Yeah.
The worst thing you can do is just wait till it's too late.
Well, Colin, thank you so much for sharing your story with all of us and for your generosity and your bravery. It's amazing to see you in such good health. And we'll check back in a few months to see how that erection's doing. Maybe 80, 90%. We'll see. Maybe 100.
Yeah, that's my goal.
Thank you again, Colin. Take care.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
There are obviously a lot of similarities with your experience and with his, but obviously some key differences. One of the things that I found interesting was that it both happened to you young. I mean, you're a bit younger than he was, but it really sort of came out of the blue. And there have been a lot of news stories over the past few years about the epidemic of rising cancer rates among young people. Dr. Comen, how much truth is in that? Are more people being, are they getting cancer, or is it just they're being diagnosed with cancer? And what should younger people really be mindful of?
So it's definitely true, particularly in my field, breast cancer. Now, it's not astronomic, but we certainly see a rising level of or incidence of cancers, breast cancer, colon cancer. And I think this is really the time to think about advocating for yourself if you do feel something different and new and scary, that don't be afraid to go to the doctor. And it also it's a time to think about what are the risk reduction strategies that we can do? What are the things we can control and the things that we can't control? Can't control your age, your sex, your family history, but you can control how much alcohol you drink. You can control how much exercise you get. You can control your diet. You can control if you smoke. And that's not to blame or shame people that no one is perfect here.
Yeah.
Nobody is perfect in their habits. But there are things that we can do that are within our control as well to try to, there's no way to prevent cancer entirely, but you can decrease your risk of certain types of cancers.
Right. Something also sort of unique about Colin's story, although it's not really unique among men, is that he kept it to himself for a while. He told his immediate family, but he didn't want to become the guy with the testicle problem. He didn't want cancer to become part of his identity, but he also just felt weird about it. And is that something that you have experienced or witnessed? Is there a difference between the way men and women are carrying this around or messaging it?
Well, I am so thrilled about how open he was about talking about this.
Is that unusual? Is it unusual for men to be open?
I mean, I can only speak from personal
Sure,
experience because
sure.
I day in and day out, I treat predominantly women, although there are men that are diagnosed with breast cancer. I think there's shame around sexuality and sexual function in all shapes and sizes. But historically, when a man is diagnosed with prostate cancer, you can be sure his doctor is going to talk to him about erectile dysfunction before he has his surgery. Do you think historically we talk about women's sexual function? Absolutely not. Most academic centers do not have dedicated sexual health specialists for women. We are 2 times more likely to ask men about sexual side effects from targeted cancer therapy than we are to ask women. And so the same things that he's experiencing that he so beautifully is open about, women have lived with compounded shame and very little discussion about what's happening for them. And fortunately that is changing. But the shame that he feels, I think I've seen it probably 1,000-fold in my patients because nobody talks about it.
I feel compelled to snap, to clap, to give you a standing ovation. I've lived this anecdotally. The chemotherapy I did left me permanently with permanent infertility, and a byproduct of the bone marrow transplant I had at 23, which saved my life, was permanent early menopause. Nobody warned me that menopause was a side effect. I thought something was wrong with me. And at 23, 24 years old, menopause and its many symptoms was not something that my friends were talking about or familiar with. And so I thought something was wrong with me. And it's only in conversation with other young women who were in treatment who were talking about things like pain during sex that we started to piece it together. At the time, I was writing a column in the New York Times called Life Interrupted, and I wrote a column about the experience of essentially self-diagnosing myself with menopause. And the next day, I woke up to an email, very kind email, saying, "Hey, by the way, we have a sexual health clinic here at the hospital where you're being treated." And as wonderful as that was, it should not take writing a column in the New York Times to be connected to the existing resources that are available.
It's enraging.
And that sense of shame, that sense that of kind of hopelessness when you don't know what's wrong with you, when you don't know how to treat the symptoms that are appearing, compounds the difficulty of, fighting for your life in the context of cancer. But at 24, as fascinating as your cytogenetics might be, what you're really thinking about is like, how do I date? How do I live my life? How do I feel some semblance of normalcy? And the shame piece of it, the absence of communication around it that compounds that shame, was one of the biggest struggles of that period.
Did you seek out or did you have the access to something like a group therapy for either your condition or sort of just general sort of cancer patients?
I did not. There were in-person support groups, but as a patient who spent, 8 months of that first year of treatment, not only inpatient, but under medical isolation, I didn't have access to a lot of those support groups. Fortunately, a lot of those support groups now meet virtually in addition to in person. So I had to cobble together my own sort of self-styled support group through patients that I was meeting in waiting rooms, not the hospital. And so we've come a long way, I think, in terms of creating community that's there for patients if they want them. I'll also cop to the fact that I don't think I fully understood the toll that my illness is going to have on me emotionally. And so if I could travel back in time and speak to my 22-year-old self, it would be, yes, to think of cancer as an affliction of the body, but also to understand it as an affliction of the heart and of, your sense of identity and self, and finding that therapeutic support, be it in the context of, a young adult cancer group or therapy, or ideally all of the above, is something ideally that you put in place before you desperately need it.
I just want to pick up on a couple of the things that you said about a cancer diagnosis and the physical components of it, but then also our inability or lack of attention to the heart. And we were talking about sexual function before, and which is just a huge passion of mine, no pun intended, because we leave it untended to for women. And with respect to therapy and group moments, it's great when women can come together and be like, this sucks. Like, we're the sisterhood of like, this is terrible. But we also have to have a medical community that's addressing the actual physical needs, because your heart's going to suffer if sex feels like razor blades, right? And so we tend to separate the mind from the body when it's so completely enmeshed. And when you think about women's sexual function and the heart and the body and all the things that go together, we can't separate that and just support group it. We actually have to have doctors and providers who will have interventions which exist, which I hope you're getting, that can help in very meaningful ways.
So the good news, things are changing, even just in your time as an oncologist and your time as a patient. Attitudes and approaches to cancer diagnosis, prevention, treatment are changing for the better. As somebody at NYU Langone Health, really at the forefront of innovation and progress, astonishing progress, what are you most excited about? What treatments, what final frontiers, whether it's in your particular field of breast cancer or just sort of cancer treatment broadly defined?
I think in general, what we've wanted for so long, for the last few decades, is really personalized care. But I think we're actually moving towards that, understanding cancer at the single cell level, meaning that we're not just doing PET scans and looking for big tumors, but that moving towards the future, we're able to kind of pull out that needle in a haystack, not just by a bone marrow biopsy, but by a blood sample, whether it's a leukemia or whether it's a prostate cancer, whether it's a breast cancer, and really hunting down those cells that can wreak havoc on the body when they multiply, and really understanding at the most minuscule granular level what is helping a cancer grow, far beyond actually a large tumor, but as that kind of single bullet that's running around. And I'm really thrilled about the progress we're making in that space.
I think we've covered everything. Thank you both so much for being here. Suleika, in particular, it's great to see you here and looking so well. Good luck with chemotherapy today.
Thank you. Fun.
You brought a good book or a podcast. I'm Dr. Comen. Thank you so much for coming by, and we'll see you next time on The Future You.